Hi, and welcome to another community learning session. We are gathered tonight in this online forum really to develop our Indigenous awareness through conversation, through inquiry, through telling stories and sharing. And I really do believe that, as we come to this conversation, that many of us have a strong desire to see our country move towards truth and reconciliation. So we begin. We open up space for conversation. We kind of come with a sense of humility and a sense of just recognizing that we need to learn. And even if it's uncomfortable, like we talked about, even if it's a little bit challenging and scary to talk about things that maybe we're not expert in or we don't know, I think we need to learn, so we need to come and we need to begin. And so welcome. Here we are. I am Jody Getson. I'm your host for tonight, and I welcome you to this time of learning. And the first thing I want to share with you that you need to know is that I'm not coming tonight as an expert or anything in this topic, but as one who wants to learn. Like many of you, I'm watching the news. I'm a Canadian citizen, and I'm hearing things, and I'm wrestling. And I'm wrestling with these topics. And so I'm coming here as a learner, just like everyone else. So I ask for your grace tonight as we talk and learn together. Maybe there'll be something expressed that's not as thought through, but I want to come bravely and boldly because it's time. It's time we do something. It's the time that we start. So I want you to know too, your questions all night long. If you have questions as we're talking, you can throw them in the comments, and we have someone here that's monitoring the chat, and we'll bring them forward. We hope to have time at the end. So with that, I want to let you introduce you to our guest for tonight. This is Manson Glode. He's a friend of mine, and he is Mi'kmaq from Millbrook First Nation. Manson is retired now, enjoying the retired life, but for years he had a long career with Indigenous Service Canada. And so Manson and I, we've been talking about this for a long time, haven't we?
Yes.
In fact,
Yep.
Back when things kind of really escalated months ago, we did a community learning on prejudice and privilege and racism, and we talked and prepared some of this back then, but it wasn't the right time. And now we talked this week and we said now is the time. So welcome, Manson. Thank you for being willing to come on and help us with this discussion tonight.
Yeah. Well, Jody, thanks for having me. It's first off, I want to thank you for inviting me. It's as you said, it's really like a deep problem. It's deep, and maybe problem is the wrong word, but I think issues.
It's heavy.
It's heavy.
It's heavy.
And
Yep.
I think, like yourself, I'm no expert, but I worked in the field. I've grown up on First Nation, so just hopefully I can share my perspective on stuff.
Absolutely. Well, that's where we're going to start. I would just love to hear from you as an Indigenous person. Just what's your story, life through your lens? I mean, we only have a little bit of time, but just, growing up, how was it for you?
Well, as you mentioned, I grew up in Millbrook First Nation,
Mm-hmm.
in Truro, and it was interesting because we were a part of the town of Truro. And so, the community of Truro was right next door to us.
That's right.
Right, so it was really interesting. I attended Catholic school in Truro, and I had grown up on reserve, and had friends, and that was our community. That was my home. And really, when I came to Amherst, I had an opportunity to work with, back then it was referred to Indian and Northern Affairs Canada, back in 1979. And it was only supposed to be for a year. And so I was very fortunate that I was able to hang on and
They kept
retire.
you.
They kept me and retired there after 36 years probably. But I can remember, growing up, especially, attending Catholic school, that it was interesting because we were bused to the school, St. Mary's School on King Street, and it was funny about that because our community, Millbrook, moved 3 times. We were located previously in Bible Hill.
Oh.
And so just, if you know Bible Hill at all, there's a subway and there's a sharp turn, and right at that turn was kind of the area that our community was at. Then we got moved, and we moved to where the Catholic school was located. So we were there for a period of time, and then we eventually got moved out to our present-day community.
So did that feel wrong to you that you were moved? Did
Well,
you notice it to be?
Well, we weren't, like, for me personally, like, the only place I knew was Millbrook, where it's located now.
Okay.
But when you go back and you talk to some of the elders, they're, oh no, we used to be here and we used to be there, and I find it interesting that the Catholic school ended up there in one of the locations where we used to live. And, interesting. So we came to that school. We were, as I said, we were bused there. We attended classes. We had religious education class, like catechism class, usually first thing in the morning. But we were treated differently, and for me, you don't, like, I didn't notice it right away.
Okay, so that's a great question. How old were you when you started to feel I'm different? I mean, when you're in a community, you don't know, you don't feel different.
You don't feel
you're
different.
like everyone else.
Yeah.
How old were you? Can you remember when you started to kind of think, hey, I'm different, or people are treating me differently, or something?
Well, when I think back, I think it was probably right when we started, like almost the minute we stepped off the bus. Like when I think back, we're at school, I thought, okay, there's something different about this, and it was, there would be comments like, after school. Of course, a bus is a bus, right? Buses are never on time, and we'd be waiting for a bus, right? And so our bus would roll in the yard, the schoolyard, and then somebody would yell out, "The Indian bus is here." So the funny thing about it was that was the only bus that came there. Like,
right.
But it was no different. Like, it was
It looked like any other bus.
Like, it was, the classic yellow limousine, right?
Yeah.
But with that, that's when you knew things were.
There's a classification.
There's something different about this. And even at lunchtime, when we used to go down, like, we used to have lunch at the school, or in the school basement, we would come down and there would be 2 separate lines. Like, we would all go and get our milk, but there would be the Indian line and everybody else.
Now, did that just happen naturally, or was this was your line and
this
was
is our line and that was their line?
Wow.
And really, like, I mean, we were given our milk, right? And we'd take it and go. The other line, they would go, and milk back then was maybe 5 or 10 cents, right?
Don't date yourself, man.
Yeah, I know. Right? And so there was stuff like that. It was like, like little things like that that would
That's right.
it when you think back, like, gee, why was that? Why
Did it have to really be that way?
did it have to be that way?
We're getting milk.
Yeah, and I've spoken to other groups before about this, and I mentioned this whole lunch line thing, and they grew up in another community in Nova Scotia, and it brought back a memory that they came up to me after and said, I remember that milk line.
Wow.
So even I think it affected us as First Nation people, Indigenous people, whatever. It affected others, and I think as you mature, you start to think, okay, so why was that? Why did they? Why?
So do you think some of that separation and classification that you began to experience as you started school, do you think that impacts you today? Do you feel that there's stuff that you're still kind of working through?
I think there is.
Yeah.
There's like if I'll stop and think about something that say from school, and like, gee, why was that? Why did they say the Indian bus was here?
Yeah.
Like it was.
So you still have some stuff to reconcile.
Oh yeah, I still
Yeah.
but then too, some of my classmates that we went to school with, they became really good friends, and they've made the comment, what were we thinking, or
Yeah.
why was that, or
Yeah.
how come this, and we just
Yeah.
sit there and have a chat about it, scratch our heads about it, and say, gee, I don't know.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's part of even where we're going to go tonight as we dig into the residential school issue and all this, stuff. Some of it is just, there's no answer. There's just wrestling with an uncomfortable truth, and that's sometimes hard to do. And one of the things you and I talked about a little bit is important for me. I did the same thing back when I had the other community learning. I want to acknowledge a few things as we begin, and as we kind of will unpack your story a bit, even as we talk about other things tonight. But I'd like to hear from you, Manson. There's words, and words matter, and the words have changed over time. So we see a lot of Indigenous, I use that word particularly as we planned, for tonight. But what words are better that we not use, and what's acceptable as we talk about the community going forward?
Well, I think it's gone from, Indian, it's gone to Aboriginal, it's gone to First Nation, and the current thinking is Indigenous. And so, when you look back at that, the history of that, and again, you almost have to take a minute and kind of look back and say, oh, gee, and you can see how, as titles have progressed,
Yeah.
or whatever you want to call them,
Yep.
there seems to be a movement forward of, how we deal with this. I mean, Indian, is almost a misnomer.
Right. Now, do you take offense to that?
Personally, I don't.
Yeah.
I don't. But I can see where others would.
Do. I know when I found it interesting when we had the panel, I had a couple of guests that were black, and I asked them the same question when we did the racism. And it was interesting because in the two guests, one said, I'm a black woman. I want you to call me a black woman. That's what I am. And the other gentleman, he said, I prefer a person of color. But she didn't like that. So some of it is we have to learn, and we have to inquire with people what's comfortable for them. but I think we've come to the understanding that the best word, best terminology for us to use is to address it as an Indigenous community.
As an Indigenous community.
Right. And another thing that is important to acknowledge is not just the names that we use, but the land. Now, the land is a big topic that we probably won't get into tonight, but I do want to acknowledge, even as we are here taping in Oxford, Nova Scotia, this tonight, we are on the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. And so let me ask you, Manson, what does that mean to you to hear that acknowledged?
It's funny because over the course of time, I have to say, people have asked me questions like even since high school.
Yeah.
Well, what do you think of this as a Native person? Right?
You get to speak on behalf, but it's your story.
And so there were times when I thought, I don't know, like it. Mm-hmm. Even as we move forward as a Mi'kmaq community, like as Mi'kmaq people, it's and I don't think I'm unique in this, but I think all of us are starting to process this whole thing in our own minds. And so when you just asked that, how does that make me feel about recognition of being
acknowledgement,
of being on unceded Mi'kmaq territory. To me, it's like, oh, yeah, like, thank you.
Thank you.
Because
okay.
it's it when you say that, like it has a meaning to non-Indigenous people, and it has a meaning for Indigenous people. And I think when people recognize that, then to me that's a positive step forward.
So I think that's good, and even for you parents out there listening tonight, these are good things to sit down and talk with your children about words, that they matter, and acknowledgement matters, and why we acknowledge land and why that's important. So just little helpful kind of bits as we begin to unpack. But I know that many people are looking now and they're thinking about everything that we've seen on the news. And in case you are tuning in and you just aren't sure on all of it, I just kind of want to recap and bring us all on the same page. There was a mass grave recently found containing 215 children, and some were as young as, I've read, as age 3.
3, yeah.
That they were found in Canada at a former residential school, and that was the Kamloops Indian Residential School in British Columbia. Now, in looking, I see that this actually was a school opened under Roman Catholic administration in late 1890s, in the late 1800s, sometimes having as many as 500 students, and it was in fact the largest of the residential schools. It was turned over to the government in 1969 and closed in 1978. And so as we non-Indigenous people have heard this, some of us are becoming familiar with residential schools maybe for the first time. And so there's a lot of inquiry and wrestling that's happening. But I just want to acknowledge these 215 children who were innocent and were, I know they're looking into to try to understand what happened. But it's because of this that we're having this conversation. And so I feel like we should just take just a moment in silence just to recognize them tonight. So let's talk about it. Residential schools. Something, like I said, some of us are just trying to grasp. And the thing I want to acknowledge and just be clear on tonight is we and I and others know so little. We really need the people who have experienced this to listen to them and to hear. And we're going to talk about that in moments as we try to cover some of the different parts of this conversation that are important, Manson. So why don't you kind of just begin Tell us what they are, what you know about them, what you understand, and we'll try to kind of wrestle through some of that and the important things together.
Well, historically, and this goes back, you know, to Confederation, really, back in 1867. You know, you had, you know, Canada as a country, you know, a newborn country coming together, you know, provinces, territories coming in to the Canadian Confederation, and you know they were struggling with powers. Like, okay, so the provinces, you're responsible for this, you're responsible for that, you do this, you do that, and so when the dust settled, Indigenous people, or Indians as they were known
At
that time, were a responsibility of the federal government. That's kind of where we ended up.
Landed, yep.
Yeah, and so as part of that, and even recently when you talk about John A. Macdonald, his role in this whole residential school system has come to light. And there's information out there that basically, you know, John A. Macdonald, you know, the first Prime Minister of Canada, said, no, we got to do something. And we've got to get these savages into school, indoctrinated, you know, assimilated, because if they stay with savages, if they stay in their own community, they will be taught by what we would consider our elders, and what, you know, the first government, the early governments of this country, call savages. So you know, you're being taught by savages, you'll become a savage. And that's how, you know, it kind of how it began. And the churches got involved, and here in Atlantic Canada, in Nova Scotia, the Catholic Church got involved, and you know, it was, you know, part of that whole assimilation, you know, civilizing Indians, and yes, let's move on, and the one way that you destroy a culture is take away their language.
That's right.
Because you take away their identity. And so when you do that, then you break people's spirit. And so we had our people's spirit broken for the whole idea of, no, we've got to take you in.
There was this sense that the Eurocentric kind of way was the right way, and going to be adopted as the Canadian way, and we need to bring you in line.
Yes. So really, I mean, not, and this is going to sound nasty, and I'm going to apologize it right up front, but if you're not white, you're not right.
That's
right. So the whole residential school system, that was their goal, to assimilate Native people and to make them productive members of society, or how they viewed society should be. And you know, it went on from there. And as time went on, they were starting to see that the residential school system wasn't working. You know, it wasn't getting, you know, the results that they wanted. And I think it speaks to those 215 Indigenous souls, and those that went through the residential school system, that their spirit was a little stronger than that. And even though it's caused like immeasurable grief and hardship
And harm. Yep.
and harm, the native culture, the indigenous culture, the Mi'kmaq culture was still there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think with as the residential school moved on, it was, as I said, it was seen as something that wasn't working.
Mm-hmm.
And they started to close.
And I read a little bit in just trying to learn a bit more about it. And it says from 1863 to 1998, more than 150,000 Indigenous children. That is a massive number in this country. Were taken from their families and placed in these schools. So children, the picture as I understand it, was that they would be many times forcibly removed from their home and taken to be assimilated into the new Canadian way.
Yeah, the new Canadian way.
And oftentimes they were mistreated and degraded and abused. The mortality rate was high. And I was reading some things, Manson, that they would do things like as the children would come to the residential school, they would cut their hair. And that has spiritual significance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much
the braids.
So. Yeah.
Right, and so that was just disregarded.
Yeah.
And their hair was cut, and their Aboriginal name that they were given was taken, and they were given a new name,
a
and
new
even
Christian name. Yeah.
a new Christian name,
Yeah.
and a number.
Yeah.
And a number.
And a number.
And their clothing, their traditional clothing, taken, school uniform.
Yep.
Teachers, I was reading about the schools were often, not in great shape, and the ventilation was poor, and when there would be a sickness, it would just spread. I even started to wonder, just my own thinking, like, could that be a mass, something went through the place, for so many children to be in a mass grave. Their siblings, I read how they would be separated, and their language, like you said, language, things that are substantive to a person's person, removed.
Removed, yeah.
And this is tough to acknowledge. It's hard to swallow. It's hard to think about. It's painful to consider. The impacts are lasting forever. So it's hard for us to know where to go with that. Like, what do we do? So you and I began to talk about some things that have been done in our conversation. Yeah. And I was pleased in talking with Manson and learning that our government, because my first thing is, what do we do with this? Like, who apologizes? Where does it come from? How do we begin reconciliation? And in 2008, right, I read that Stephen Harper officially apologized. And that led maybe to the forming of the commission that was launched that became the Truth and Reconciliation.
Yep.
So we're going to talk a little bit. If you haven't heard about this will be a really helpful, I think, time of learning. There's a couple of different reports that Manson and I have been talking about as we've been learning and understanding this situation. But one thing Manson said to me, so I'm going to just share your words for a minute. He said, am I an okay person to talk about this? Because while I'm an Indigenous man, I haven't been in this residential school. And I think at the end of the day, in this document that was put out as a report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, it's the survivor stories. The survivors speak. We're going to put the link to this so that you can check this out. And I encourage you to do this, because this tells the story from the people who it is their story. If we're going to learn and understand, it has to be from a person's own story. And there was a lot of really powerful things, even in the preface, that was written for this document. And it closes with this. It says, in this, the survivors speak of their pain, loneliness, and suffering, and of their accomplishments. Survivors, in that it talks a little bit about survivors, not a negative term. It speaks to the sustaining power in the spirit of a person. It says, while this is a difficult story, it's a story of courage and endurance. The first step, I love this is their words, the first step in any process of national reconciliation requires us to attend to these voices, which have been silenced for far too long. We encourage all Canadians to do so. So I encourage you, just as I have, to begin to look at some stories. You don't have to read every person's story, but consider some of them as they reflect. And in this, they have arranged it such that it's really neat. They give stories on their arrival at the schools, the language issue, bedwetting, the food that they were made to eat, which they didn't recognize, chores, the religion that was taught, how siblings were separated, how parental contact was limited, you know, some of the emotional trauma, the discipline, the abuse, and some of the success like that they had despite. And so this is a really important document, and I would encourage you to, even tonight or in this next few days, to read the preface. It very clearly outlines this whole apology that came from Stephen Harper, and that this is a part of the broader Canadian story where the government gained control over Aboriginal land and peoples. They disrupted the Aboriginal governments and economies and sought to repress Aboriginal cultures and spiritual practices. They say the government, often in partnership with the country's major religious bodies, sought to civilize and Christianize and ultimately assimilate Aboriginal people into Canadian society. And as you read on, they thought that the decision to invest in residential schools was based on the belief that the cultural and spiritual transformation that the government and churches sought to bring about in the Aboriginal people could be most effectively accomplished in institutions that broke the bonds between parent and child.
Yeah.
And I'm going to tell you this it will hurt your heart to read, but it's important part of our Canadian history. It's an important part of us understanding each other. It's important for us to hear stories and take time. And we talked, just as we were prepping tonight, we talked a little bit about the impact when you throw a big rock in the water. If you're standing close, you feel the impacts, you know, really strong. But as the ripples get farther and farther, the impact dies out. And it can be easy for some of us non-Indigenous people to be far away from this and not feel the impacts and just leave it there. But I think as we see what we're seeing and as we read what we're reading in the news, we're like, we can't stay back there when our fellow Canadians are hit so hard by the impacts of this. We have to understand. We have to talk about it. So I really encourage people, right, Manson, to check this out.
And it's interesting that, Jody, that you mentioned like history. You know, there's I had a discussion with a history professor friend of mine about that very term, history. And you know, when we talk about the treaties, the old treaties, 1752, like the historic treaties.
Right.
There's there's been various court cases, that had their foundation on these treaties, and there was no written history. And it's interesting that unless it's written, then it's not given credibility. Right? So even like if it's written, then it must be true.
That's right. But
as this process goes on, like the court cases with the historical treaties and stuff, some of the like the Truth and Reconciliation. I mean, there's been other reports done by the federal government that is meant to address different issues. Once people have had their say Once the survivors have had their stories, then it's written.
That's right.
And then so now
It's history.
it's
Yeah.
history. And I think, a lot of times history doesn't seem to have an impact,
Mm-hmm.
as it takes years,
Mm-hmm.
for some historical event to be kind of written about and then discussed and kind of reflected on. But I think now and I think it's a good thing that you have these stories of their lives written, and as you say, now become part of history, and now it's a modern history, like it's an evolving history, and to me that part of it is exciting.
Is good, and it's bringing it to us. We can't run from this. We don't want to hide it. We don't want our history classes to tell another version of history.
Exactly.
This is the conversation that we need to be having. And so that actually is a good kind of segue into the other report that I really encourage everybody to read, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We're going to put the link to their calls to action. They put together 94. Now these are the experts who are telling us these are the actions that we need to take on behalf of the Indigenous to bring truth and reconciliation forward. So what they're saying, I think we need to read it. We need to understand them. I've read through this. I've got notes all over it. I mean, I would say at a high level, they're asking for equality and justice in education, in healthcare, access to services, things that are culturally appropriate, and a really key thing that comes up, I noticed, Manson, over and over in this document is a reference to the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. So I printed that out as well, and I read through that. And we're going to make the UN Declaration available to you in the links, and we're going to make the calls to action available to you if you want to read further. But while we don't have time to discuss 92 or 94 of them, there was a couple that I just wanted to address as I stand here as a person in the church. And there's a section in this that talks about what they're calling the church to. And this is number 49. It says, "We call upon all religious denominations and faith groups who have not already done so to repudiate concepts used to justify European sovereignty over Indigenous lands and people, such as the doctrine of discovery." And if you're not sure what that is the international law that gave license to explorers to claim vacant land in the name of their sovereign. So they're asking us as denominational and religious leaders to explain and to speak that these things are not to be perpetuated into the future. And I think that's a fair ask. Do you?
Yeah, I think it is.
And they ask that we look in this post-apology process on reconciliation, that we see that we're holding the government to account. I think that's fair. I think that's something that we can all do. And we're going to sum these up as we wrap tonight, just action steps that you can take. But the next one and the last one I kind of want to look at is, we call the church parties and their respective congregations to learn about their church's role in colonization, the history and legacy of residential schools, why apologies to students and their families were and are necessary. And I think that's important. I mean, that's what we're doing. I will be honest, sometimes I feel like maybe I should have known more earlier, or I could begin to condemn myself. But it's not about me. I need to just step up and say, now is the time I can learn more. And I can read these things and I can share on behalf of doing what's right. And there's a bullet in here that says building capacity for intercultural understanding, empathy, and mutual respect. And I say, I'm in. I'm all for that. Just really a good document with lots of things that are reasonable for us to be able to achieve. And I didn't find this, but you said 10 of the 94 are
Yep.
complete and 10 are in progress.
Well, 10 have been completed.
Okay.
There are 40 that have projects that are proposed.
Okay.
And then there's 24 that are underway that
Okay.
have stuff to address the recommendation.
Mhm.
And there are 20 that are not yet started.
Okay. Wow. So let me just kind of pull this together a little bit. So we recognize that the 215 children that were found in the mass grave, that brought to light an opportunity that you said for us to learn about this part of our history and face it and begin to move toward truth and reconciliation. They say in the commission report, as I read earlier, in that preface, in the stories of the people, again, it is so clearly explaining this residential school situation. It's so worth a read. And the first step is listening to their stories. And another step is understanding the calls to action, and that many of them are government, needing our provincial and federal government people to take action. So we, as people, we can check in. What are you doing? What are my local MLA, my local MP, how are you moving this forward for provincial and municipal and federal affairs? So there's things that we can do. And I did learn that there's a missing children project that now has 4,100 children who died while attending a residential school. So that's 4,100. And there's 150,000 that went there. And there was a class action lawsuit, and there has been apologies. And I read that some of the church began to give apologies even in the 80s and recognizing the colonialist kind of things that they did wrong in driving their agenda, and then recognizing about the schools too. So we're moving forward, and that's what we can do.
Yeah.
And so now I'm going to bring this home to me a little bit. We're on Oxnaz Online. This is a community learning. This is not a church as we maybe typically think of it, but I can't hide from the fact that I'm a pastor, and so I have been wrestling with this, and I know you as a Catholic man, you have been as well. And someone asked me, so I want to ask you, Manson. We're hitting the heavy stuff now, and I know we don't have answers, but I feel it's important to address. How do you, as an Indigenous person, continue, with what the church did in practice as a practicing Catholic?
I've been asked that question
Yes.
many times, and it's hard.
It's tough.
It's a question I say gee, I don't know. I don't know why. I don't know how. Is it is it a deep faith? Is it a cultural faith that keeps me going, keeps us going? Is it like most churches, they'll put the fear of God in you, is it that? Or what is it? What keeps you going? And there's Indigenous people that embrace faith.
Absolutely.
And I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And I think that points to the fact, Manson, that we're still wrestling with some of these things. Let me just put out there to everyone, it's okay to still wrestle, but maybe you have questions. I'm going to kind of share a few thoughts that I have, so I'm just going to encourage you, as we're coming to 15 minutes to the hour, I want to make sure that we have a few moments for your questions if you have them. But I just want to be transparent and put it on the table. This has been hard for me too. It's hard for me to hear, and I'm glad, and I'm okay that you're sitting in it and you haven't figured it, that you're just wrestling with with it. Some things we might not have answers for. And I know that it was posed to me, like, as a church leader, how do you feel? And someone actually really wise said something to me, and it made me pause. You know, look what the church did to Jesus. I mean, as a church, as a Christian, Jesus is the center of our faith, and it was the religious people who killed him. Religion, you know, many people can't reconcile with religion because of the Crusades. Religion mixed with, and this is just my personal wrestling, so I'm not speaking on behalf of the entire, you know, pastorate. But the church, when it's mixed as government, as power, as society, as organization, religion, fails. It failed all through history. But in my heart, I'm wrestling and reconciling with the fact that I understand the church differently. I understand that I'm a follower of Jesus, and I look to him, and he said, and I'm not trying to preach, I'm just reflecting on the whole Christian piece, the church connection in this. Jesus said, you know, I boil everything down to this: love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and love others as yourself. So as a follower, I'm following the one and emulating the one who says, love people deeply and love me. And I don't see any part of this that's loving a person. And so it's hard for me to wrestle with it because it's called church and I lead a church, but I really don't want to be a religious person. I'm not a religious person or following a religion. I follow a person, and I believe that the one who made people would have a broken heart, as I do, seeing what happened to people because people thought they were better than other people. I think racism and power struggles in people has been horrific in our world. And the fact that it's tied together with church and religion, it hurts me deeply. So I too will linger there and wrestle with that. And I can only be part of what can I do to move forward towards truth and reconciliation. And so that's where we're at. That's why we're doing this. And why I want to have this conversation when I'm on my own journey of understanding people and loving people and understanding the things that have impacted them. I'm not setting myself up as the one who's the greatest in this, but as one who feels that we need to move to that.
And I think it's you know, you said, you know, you hit the nail on the head. You know what the impact, right? What, and I think that's part of the issue is that what you know as Jesus hung on the cross. You know, said, Father, forgive them; they know not what they're doing. And so it's important that we understand, or try to understand anyway, that what impact has this had on who we are as Indigenous people, on who the church is. You know, as an organization and as individuals,
and
right?
Our country,
and a country,
and our church and our country, both.
And I think it's that process that it'll change, and it's really, I think it's more about understanding. I think it's you know, there's so many issues that you know, the Indigenous communities have to come to grips with, the government has to come to grips with, and Canadians have to come to grips with.
Yep.
And it's sometimes it can be like so small that it almost goes unnoticed. And I think it's just that whole notion of just being aware. You know, there's tons of people out there that, you know, have know the issues, have a background in issues, these issues that are that we're facing, and I think they would welcome a conversation, like, you know, like, you know, explain what is this, how is this, why is this, you know,
yeah, and how can we move forward?
How can we move forward? Yeah.
So I think there's lots more things we could get into, and if, like I say, if there's a question, ask it now, because I want to talk about action steps. Thank you for listening and kind of joining with us as we kind of, you know, try to bring a little bit of light to the whole education system, the residential school, where that came from, point you to some resources to learn more. But I kind of want to sum up, and then I'm going to give Manson the last word, but I want to sum up some things that we can do. So this is a great point to, even later when the video is up, you can just go to this point in the video and bring your kids in, bring others in. These are some things we can do. I feel the first one is start and join a conversation. What can you do to move our country forward and people, truth and reconciliation? Talk. Begin a conversation. Be humble and willing to learn, and admit that there's so much that you don't understand. Be a person who inquires without taking a prideful or defensive stance. And I think it's important that we learn about the land that we live on. And there's a link we're going to throw in the comments. It's a website that you can go to in Canada to see the Indigenous people that first were on the land where you live, and you can learn about them. Show that to your children. Learn about where you are and acknowledge that. And that's an important and easy first step. It's nativeland.ca, so check out that link. That's an easy one. Again, read the link that we shared on the Truth and Reconciliation's 94 calls to action. And just take that small commitment that you can send an email to your MLA, your MP, and say, here's the report, send the link, and say, what are we doing about it here? Have you taken any action? And put your voice as one who wants to see these things, these 40 initiatives that are in place right now, to see them getting moved forward. Read the stories of survivors. Bring yourself closer to the impact, and so that you can understand. I think it's reasonable to recognize that we don't know what we don't know, but just turning a blind eye to it is not acceptable anymore. It's never been acceptable, but we only have today and moving forward. So let's really look into the stories and understand and be kind. I think the more that I learn about people and experience different things in different cultures, the more that I understand we need to just be kind to each other, because you don't know the impact that this has had, Manson, and the trauma that would be multiplied through generations. And even as we did a community learning on trauma. If you haven't, you can check that out on our YouTube. We have all of our community learning sessions there. But I learned in that one about trauma. The more and more childhood trauma that you're exposed to, the likelihood you have to very negative coping behaviors. And that helped me to grow in empathy and understanding. And so we need to be kind and understand that, it's easy to accuse or point fingers, but understanding why the situation is for people where it is and what was done wrong to them, it's important. And if you know someone and this brings out that they're a survivor of residential schools, you can walk alongside them in their journey to healing and recovery and be a voice towards reconciliation. So there is actual practical steps that we can take. Even if we wish we were farther along, we're here where we are and we can move forward. And so I hope that you will be encouraged to take some of those steps tonight. And do we have any questions? No? So I'm going to give you the last word, Manson. If you could kind of leave people with one thought, kind of one important overall, what would you say as we wrap tonight?
I would say, as best you can, seek out the information. Like, there's, as I said earlier, there's lots of good information out there that people can look at, they can review. I think it's important to start a conversation if you have an opportunity to take part in a discussion or start a discussion with somebody, then it's a good first step. What I'll caution though is, keep an open mind. There's a lot of stuff that when you look at the residential school issue, there's more to it. There's a whole history of stuff that if we had more time, we could talk more about it. But there's so much stuff. The issues are so complex that it's going to take a process, and I think if everybody kind of engages in that process and lends their voice to solutions, then I think we'll move forward.
That's awesome. And I do remember, I guess, one more thing that I wanted to share was we had talked about some of the other issues outside residential school that have kind of came to the forefront, and another one was the fishery. And I have a link that I found, was helpful in helping me to kind of learn and understand the story. And like Manson, you talked about the 1700s, the peace and friendship treaties, and what was defined and what was left undefined, and where we need to go to bring connection there so that there's not, animosity and anger and hatred, but to bring some reconciliation and healing in that. It was put out by a law firm, but I thought it gave a lot of helpful information, and maybe that's another issue around Indigenous affairs that you have wanted to learn more about. So we'll include that in the comments as well. And I just want to thank you, Manson, for sharing a little about your story, being vulnerable, to talk about being different, and that was really impactful for me to think about something as simple as the milk line, but segregating people to get a glass of milk, how unnecessary and how long-lasting little things, let alone the big things that we're uncovering. So thank you so much for just being willing to come, and thank you for spending your time to learn. That shows that you care about people and the path towards reconciliation. I hope this was helpful. Again, if you have questions even later, you can send us a private message. Keep in touch, and we'll have more community learning to come.